I'm glad to be here. I thought what I'd do is I'd just give you a quick little background about how I came to be so passionately interested in this work that I'm doing now in hope theory. Because there's a lot of people that ask that question. It's like, why is the prosecuting attorney here talking about hope, right? They don't necessarily logically go together. But I was brought to hope theory through my work with crime victims. When I was a deputy prosecutor, before I got elected, the focus of my practice was in the area that we call special victims. So if you've seen Law and Order SVT, or SVU, I guess, we call it SVT in our shop, you know the kinds of cases that I'm talking about. And so I was working with adults and children who had experienced trauma through their victimization. And I became really interested in trauma and how trauma impacts people, right? But the thing that always troubled me about that is I couldn't come across anything that was about how do we help people work through trauma, right? And get to the other side of trauma. And how do we help build resilience, if you will, to those, the negative outcomes that people experience when they experience trauma. And so at a domestic violence conference about 10 or 11 years ago now, I walked into a breakout session that the title had the words trauma and hope in it. And I walked in because of the word trauma, but when I walked out, I was totally about hope. And the teacher of that breakout was a gentleman named Dr. Chan Hellman, who's a hope researcher at the University of Oklahoma, is now a very good friend of mine. I call him my personal hope mentor. And I've been inspired about this work ever since. So I started in that and started looking at hope and how it impacts trauma. But then I realized that hope has such broad applications because hope is just innately human. So anything that we do as human beings is potentially impacted by this thing that we call hope. And so I started thinking about, well, how does hope impact organizations, teams, leadership, all of those kinds of things? And from all of that work over the last decade now, you'll see the latest version of what I call hope-inspired leadership. This is about building up to what I would call a leadership philosophy. This is not about management. It's not about, it's not specific tools or anything for your toolbox. This is very philosophical. It really gets down to the bottom of what I think leadership is about, effective leadership is about, and how we build organizations and teams. I'm not going to teach you anything really that you don't already know, because as human beings, we know what hope is, right? And the research tells us that we are actually physically built to be hopeful. As human beings, it is in our construct to be hopeful. And so I'm not teaching you that. What I'm going to give you, though, is some vocabulary and a framework to think differently about hope, okay? And so what if we, I think everybody would acknowledge that hope matters. Hope is important. If you were listening and paying attention during the pandemic, the word hope was being used a lot because as human beings, we just intuitively, instinctively gravitate towards hope to get through adversity. That's why it's so powerful when it comes to the work that I have done in trauma as well. That's what we cling to when we're dealing with adversity. And I think people would say, yes, hope matters. It's important, right? But what if we had a way of thinking about hope such that hope was a set of skills and was a choice, right? That hope was a way of thinking and not necessarily just a way of feeling. And it would make it usable, teachable, right? We could share hope with others. Have you heard that expression, hope is not a strategy? Hope is not a strategy. That's the thing that I take the most issue with today, right? Because today what I want to try to do is give you a way of thinking about hope such that hope is a strategy. It can be a strategy for team building. It can be a strategy for service delivery. It can be a strategy for leadership, and can be a strategy for life. So what does it mean to be hopeful, right? I know a few people in this audience have seen me talk about this before, some multiple times. I was teasing David back there that if something happened to me, I might ask him to come up and finish it for me because he's seen it several times before. And yes, I'm still using the Wizard of Oz as my metaphor because I haven't found a better one. Everybody knows the story of the Wizard of Oz, okay? And I like this story to help me illustrate this idea of hope. What does it mean to be hopeful? So let's look at the character of Dorothy in The Wizard of Oz. At the very beginning of that film, Dorothy is dealing with a problem, right? The neighbor lady wants to take her dog, Toto, and she's very upset about this. And she sees this as a major problem, okay? So she goes around and starts asking people on the farm for help, the farm hands. And that's how you end up meeting all the characters that are going to come later in the film. But all of them are saying, Dorothy, this is not a big problem. We've got more important things to deal with. Go away, okay? And finally, Dorothy ends up with Aunt Em and explains this problem, and Aunt Em says the very same thing. Dorothy, just go away. This is not a big problem right now for us. We've got bigger things to deal with. And so Dorothy walks off with Toto into the farmyard and sings that ever-famous song, Over the Rainbow, the most covered song from a musical in history. And at first impression, you might think Over the Rainbow is a song about hope, right? Think of the metaphoric language that's there in that song. Somewhere over the rainbow, bluebirds fly, where dreams that you dare to dream really do come true. Clearly, Dorothy's talking about the future. Somewhere out there is a better future, okay? And so you might say, well, Dorothy's hopeful because she believes the future can be better. Bluebirds fly, dreams come true, right? But then you get to the end of the song and Dorothy gives you a clue that gives you more information about her level of hope. She says, if birds fly over the rainbow, why, oh, why can't I? Why, oh, why can't I? Okay? So Dorothy at that moment is basically saying, I believe the future can be better. I believe there's a better future out there somewhere, but I don't know how to get there. I'm stuck. I don't know how to get from here to there. And what Dorothy is telling us through that song is that she is optimistic, but not hopeful. Okay? And so I use this to distinguish this idea of optimism and hope and to give you the basic definition of hope that I will use throughout the rest of my presentation. Optimism is the belief that the future can or will be better. Okay? That's actually an acknowledged definition in positive psychology, of the belief that the future can or will be better. So Dorothy is optimistic. Hope is the belief that we can make the future better. See the difference? Little word change, big difference. And that's why Dorothy is optimistic but not hopeful, right? She believes there's a better future, but she doesn't know how to get there, okay? She doesn't know how to make the future better. She's stuck. Hope is the belief that we can make the future better. And so when you think about it in those terms, hope becomes more about what we can do. It's more empowering, right? It carries with this sense of agency, that we actually have the ability to create the future that we desire, okay? That's what hope is. So when you think about it in those terms, hope becomes a theory of positive change. Hope is always about positive change. Hope is always about making the future better. Okay? All right, so there's the basic definition of hope. Let's dig into that a little bit more. If we go a little bit further into the film, you remember that Dorothy gets caught up in this storm and she's in the house. House gets sucked up by the tornado, carried to the land of Oz, drops down in Munchkin Land, right smack on the Wicked Witch of the East, killing her, which makes her sister, the Wicked Witch of the West, very angry. And she shows up and she threatens Dorothy. I'm going to get you and your little dog too. Remember that? Yeah. So Dorothy's thinking, Oz is not such a great place for me. And she sets herself a goal. And what's her goal? To get home. There's no place like home. There's no place like home. That's her goal. Okay? Now, she starts to ask the next question that gets her to a place of hope. She says, how do I get home? And the Munchkins are there, and the Good Witch of the North comes along, you remember? And they say, Dorothy, we don't know how to get you home, but we think we know who does, and that's the wizard. You need to go and find the wizard. The wizard can get you home. Dorothy accepts that. That's my best chance to get home right now, is I've got to get to the wizard. So she's got this major goal to get home, and now she sets herself what in hope theory we would call a sub-goal, and that is to find the wizard, right? We're off to see the wizard. So she has a sub-goal. And she asks the next logical question, how do I find the wizard? And the answer, of course, is follow the yellow brick road, okay? So now Dorothy, literally and figuratively, has a pathway to her goal, right? She has a strategy. Follow the yellow brick road. That gets me to the wizard gets me home. She has a plan. Okay? Remember, a goal without a plan is just a wish. Heard that expression? That's actually true in positive psychology because the definition of a wish is a goal without a plan. Okay? But Dorothy actually has all of these things. So she has right now a desirable goal. This is something she wants and desires, a positive future for herself. Okay? This is in part built on optimism. Okay? But now the optimism takes shape into a more specific goal, a more specific desired outcome, okay? But now she's got these other two things. One, she's got a pathway to the goal, a plan, a strategy, whatever word you want to use there. In hope theory, we call it a pathway, okay? And she also has this other ever critically important element of hope, and that's agency. She feels an expectation that if she does this, she can get there. And she is willing to apply energy to do it. Psychological, physical energy. She has the willpower to move forward to achieve that goal. And when you put those three things together, a desirable goal, a pathway, and a sense of agency, that's hope. That's hope, okay? This is the vocabulary I'm talking about. So for the rest of the day, we're going to be talking about goals, pathways, and agency. But when you look at this, the cool thing about this is that hope, when you look at it in this construct, right, goals, pathways, and agency is a way of thinking, not a way of feeling. We can feel hopeful. The creator of hope theory, a psychologist by the name of Rick Snyder out of the University of Kansas, apparently hopeful things come from Kansas. Kind of the founder of hope theory, Snyder's the first one that put this out and said that hope is really a mental state. It's a cognitive process. It's a thinking process, not a feeling process. But even he would acknowledge that we feel hopeful, right? We say that all the time. We're feeling hopeful. That's not an invalid statement. What he would say is that feeling hopeful is the positive emotional reaction we have to thinking hopefully. Right? When we actually believe we can achieve the future we desire, we've got a plan to get there, we know what that goal looks like, we're motivated, we've got a sense of agency, we feel good, right? We feel hopeful, okay? But hope itself is a way of thinking. It is not about right or wrong, good or bad. We talk about hope a lot of times in that kind of positive way, right? Because for most of us, a positive future is kind of categorized that way, okay? But think about the Wicked Witch of the West. Does she have a goal? You bet. She's going to get those ruby slippers off Dorothy's feet come hell or high water, right? And the first half of the movie is about all of her strategies and attempts to do that, to get those ruby slippers. So she's got a plan, a pathway. She's highly motivated. Arguably, the Wicked Witch of the West is just as hopeful as Dorothy. Morality is the set of rules by which we choose our pathway, right? We choose our pathway according to these rules that we have for ourselves. But don't confuse hope with good or bad, right or wrong. The other thing to think about in terms of when we look at hope this way, right? Hope becomes that bridge from optimism to action. Because optimism is the belief that the future can be better, but hope now is about creating the plan to make it better. Okay? It's about creating the plan. So hope is that bridge that takes us from optimism to action towards our goal, towards our desired future. And the other cool thing that we found out in the research around hope, and everything I'm talking about here is based in this body of science called hope theory. It's been around now for about 30 years in positive psychology, 2,000 published peer-reviewed studies, and adding every day. One of the cool things about the research tells us that hope is contagious. It spreads naturally from person to person. We learn to be hopeful and we become hopeful by watching other hopeful people. So think about somebody in your life that you would describe as being that real positive, optimistic, hopeful person, right? And the energy that they're willing to commit to achieve the things that they want to achieve. And how does that make you feel? It's inspiring, right? That's that transfer of hope. It starts to transfer that feeling of hope. Dr. Hellman likes to say, I love this expression, I use the quote every time, hope is a social gift we can give each other. It's a social gift we can give each other. So when Doug's talking about the importance of that social connection in a board or a team, I think that's exactly where we're getting at, right? We have that ability to share that social gift of hope. All right, so what? We know what hope is. We intuitively, instinctively think that hope is a good thing, right? But what does the research tell us? Well, here's a few of the outcomes. Like I said, we're at well over 2,000 now. Published studies on hope, looking at all kinds of different outcomes. Almost all of those studies actually associate hope with some sort of positive outcome. Here's a few that I just throw up as good examples. This is what really caught my eye and really started to bring me into hope theory. So in the workplace, it accounts for lower absenteeism, higher productivity, right? Higher adaptability to change, higher resilience to stress, vicarious trauma, compassion fatigue, burnout, all of those things, right? And of course, people who are hopeful tend to reach their goals more often and sooner. Well, why? Because they're strategic thinkers about their goals, okay? In education, hope, the best predictor of success in college, bar none, right? SAT, ACT, high school GPA, none of those things actually have any association with success in college. When I say success, I mean engagement, academic achievement, and graduation. Right? In fact, a grad student of Snyder's, a guy named Shane Lopez, went on to work for an organization called Gallup. I'm sure you've heard of that one, right? And he was a hope theorist. And he was really focused on hope in the education arena. And he does this thing called the Student Hope Survey. He surveyed students across the country several times over. And what he will tell you is that hope is actually the only valid predictor of success in college right now. He's actually never found another one that has the type of strong correlation. In health, hopeful people are healthier generally because they see their health as a goal or a pathway, or both, right? They have higher tolerance to pain, higher resistance to things like anxiety, depression, lower rates of suicidal ideation, and at the end of the day, high hope people live longer. High hope people live longer. There's 2 mortality studies out there which have directly associated hope with longer lifespan. In my own shop a few years ago, we did our own little survey. I invited Dr. Hellman to come in and use my people as guinea pigs, which they were very glad to do. And we found that there was a very strong relationship between individual hope, the meaning that they get out of their work, that sense of meaning and purpose, and individual flourishing. Flourishing defined as positive relationships, have meaning and purpose in their life, being optimistic, having a high sense of self-worth. Very strong prediction there, correlation. So that's individual hope. And that affects each one of us individually. But as Dr. Hellman has been digging into this, he started to postulate this theory about, well, how does hope impact groups of people, right? When we bring people together, what does hope look like there, and how do we measure it? Is the hope of a group basically just the average hope score across the individuals, or is there something different? Turns out there's something different, and we now call that collective hope, that there is a separate kind of hope, separately measurable kind of hope, called collective hope. And to illustrate that, we're going to go back to the Wizard of Oz. And you remember at this point in the movie, Dorothy has now met all these other characters, right? And each one of those characters has their own goal. The Scarecrow, well, he wants a brain, right? The Tin Man, he wants a heart. The lion wants courage, or the nerve, as he says, right? And as she meets these characters, Dorothy says, well, I don't know how to get you these things, but if you come with me to find the wizard should be able to give you those things, because the wizard's going to get me home, and so the wizard is your best shot to achieve your goal. And they all embrace that and say, yep, okay, we're going to go and we're going to find the wizard. And perhaps the wizard can help us achieve our individual goal. But in doing that, they all have the same sub-goal, right? To find the wizard, okay? So I'm actually going to play this scene because there's a little transformation that happens here very subtly, but it's very powerful, because as they're going through this is the end of the Lion's song, right? They talk about each talks about their own goal. A brain, a heart, a home, the nerve. They go down the list, okay? And then the next word is we. We. What are they? They're a team. They're a team, right? A group of people working together to achieve a common goal, right? A group of people working together to achieve a common goal, the basic definition of a team. Okay? So when you think about it that way, if that's a valid definition of a team, then that common goal and the common pathway is what binds that team together, and that's collective hope, right? Collective hope is the glue that binds a team together. If you've got a group of people but you don't have collective hope, that is common goals, common pathways, you've just got a group of people working together. That's it, right? It is the achieve a common goal part that creates the team. So if we diagram this out, it looks very similar to what we saw with Dorothy individually, but a little bit different in terms of our language change. Now we've got a desirable common goal, a goal that's shared among the team, right? And it's agreed to. Everybody's bought into this goal. It's agreed to. We're off to see the wizard. Even though that is ultimately motivated by a desire to achieve an individual goal, the common goal still is the common goal, and they're motivated to achieve that, okay? They also have the other two things that we talked about. They have a collective sense of agency, the belief that we can do it, that empowerment that we can get there, right? The willingness to expend energy to get there, that sense of agency. And they have the shared pathway, the shared strategy, if you will, okay? Shared pathway towards the goal. But with collective hope, what we're starting to see is there's a fourth thing that is critically important to collective hope. Whoops. My font got a little too big on me there. Trust. Trust. Now, have you ever been in a session like this, or a class or a lecture or anything where somebody's talking about a team where you don't talk about trust? Right? Trust. Well, it turns out the research is telling us that, that trust is in and of itself a critical component of collective hope, because why am I going to share a goal and share a pathway and share this collective hope with you if I don't trust you? Okay? The research that's out there that really starts to validate this is that one of the leading predictors of collective hope is trust in leadership. Trust in leadership, right? The more that the team trusts its leadership, the more likely they are to establish and have a higher sense of collective hope. We looked at this in my own shop in that same study, and what we found was that when we take collective hope and we combine it with a couple of other things like organizational support, right? Work meeting, which is was in the other one as well, that sense of purpose, right? A virtuous organization, meaning the organization has values, a set of values, and operates by a set of values, right? Those things combined together, highest predictor of job satisfaction. Highest predictor of job satisfaction, right? We see all these studies where we see that job satisfaction isn't attached necessarily to money. Commissioner Mejia and I just had this conversation at a meeting not too long ago. That is generally true because people really are more about wanting to be part of a team, right? Okay, and when I talk about high hope and low hope, I just put this slide into there to remind me to tell you that I'm actually talking about a measurement of hope. We can measure it. Snyder developed a tool early on to measure hope, and it's been validated many times over. Us lawyers would say it's readily accepted in the scientific community, which is the test to get scientific evidence admitted in court. It's called the Fry standard, right? It's readily accepted in the scientific community as a valid measure of hope. Dr. Hellman took that individual hope scale, modified the language a little bit, and has created a collective hope scale. That's in validation right now, but he's very close to actually publishing a paper on that where the validation has been developed. All right, but we can't go around every day and just having people fill out hope scales, right? Before we talk, can you do this hope scale so I know where you're at on your hope, right? That doesn't help. Measuring is good for research, but it's not necessarily practical day to day. But the reality is people give us clues about their hope all the time, and I call those markers. They give us markers about their hope. So think back to Over the Rainbow, right? Where Dorothy says, somewhere over the rainbow, bluebirds fly. That's a marker of optimism, right? But then later says, but why, oh, why can't I? A marker of hopelessness, or of at least a loss of hope, right? So the best way to actually start to identify where people are in their hope is to listen to closely what they say and what they do, right? Because they will give you clues, they will give you markers about their hope. I see the world now through what I call a hope lens, meaning anytime anybody says something to me that has the word goal, pathway, hope, agency, or something along those lines, strategy, I'm keyed into that because I'm looking to see what that might tell me about their level of hope. Okay, so we've talked about hope, we've talked about collective hope. What about hopelessness? What does that look like? What happens when people lose hope? Well, it turns out that in the positive psychology arena, we've also documented a process that people go through as they start to lose hope. And so what's happening when we talk about hopelessness in this theory is that somebody is experiencing a barrier to their goal, okay? Something's in the way. It's like hitting that traffic jam when you're trying to get somewhere quickly and you can't get there. Your goal is blocked. And what's the first thing you feel? Frustration. My theory is, Chan and I have been talking about this. I think I'm onto something here. My theory is that this is actually part of our fight response, right? Because we fear losing the goal. We have this goal, we have this thing that we desire out in the future, and now it's blocked, and we become afraid that we can't get there, and we get mad about that, okay? So we experience this sense of anger. Now, if that resolves, if we're able to overcome that barrier, we can go back to hope just like that, no problem. Anger resolves, we're on our way, right? So traffic jam, they get it cleared, you're back on the road, feels good, right? Okay, but if this persists, eventually we go down to this thing we call despair. And that is this sense of futility, right? It's like, I still desire that goal. I still desire that future. I just have no way to get there. I don't know how to get there. And to try to get there is futile. And so we become enwrapped in this sense of despair. But that's actually not pure hopelessness. Okay? Because there still is the belief in a better future. We just can't get the pathway there. But as this process happens, and we get into this, what ends up happening is we start to really lose our sense of agency, right? Our belief that we could ever get there. And at some point, we just give up. And so the opposite of hope, or hopelessness, is actually apathy. When the person completely gives up on the future. They don't care about the future. They don't have a goal. It doesn't matter to them. They're just kind of in the moment. That's hopelessness. All right, but the cool thing is, because hope is a choice, it's a set of skills, we hold the power of hope in our hands, okay? Because we have the choice to be hopeful and to help others be hopeful. How do we do that? Starts with optimism. It always starts with optimism, right? If you don't believe the future can be better, how do you believe that you can make the future better? That's the starting point. So you got to be optimistic about the future. And as we do that, as we become optimistic about the future, the thing that we can really do to help develop that is to think about what excites us or what might excite us about the future. What could happen in the future that would be good, that would be better, right? It's about making the future better. And as we do that, we engage this thing in our brain that we call our imagination. We actually start to create a vision of the future in our mind. In hope theory, we call that creating a future memory. Because when we use our imagination to envision the future, our brain stores it into memory. Pretty cool, huh? So now we have a memory of the future. Why is that important? Because as we move forward towards that goal, that memory of the future, that memory of the outcome that we desire, keeps us motivated, right? It keeps us willing to expend that energy. Athletes do this all the time, right? So this last Winter Olympics, I'm watching the Olympics, and it's the half pipe, right? So there's a skier at the top of the half pipe, and she's up there, and she's waiting for her go signal, but there's some pause or something. The camera's on her, the commentators are talking, right? And you could see her doing this. You know, her head's moving all over. And the one guy says, "What's going on there?" And the other one says, "Well, I talked to her about this, and I'll tell you what's going on right now. Right now, she is envisioning everything that's going to happen in that pipe, right? Every jump, every move, down to a very vivid picture, okay? That's that creating a future memory. That's why we access that future memory, okay? So that becomes the motivator. But at some point, we got to take this future that we desire, this picture that we have, and we got to turn it into a goal, okay? We got to turn it into a goal. When we do that, we've got to remember that the most important thing to remember about a goal, if anything else, is it's got to be desirable and achievable for the person setting the goal. You can't make your goal somebody else's goal and expect them to be motivated to achieve your goal unless they desire your goal. Right? Right? Because eventually they're just going to no, this is your goal. I'm done. Okay? So it's got to be desirable and achievable. Think about it very logically. How much energy are you going to expend chasing a goal that you don't really desire? Not much. How much energy are you going to expend chasing a goal that might be desirable, but that you don't actually ever believe you can achieve? Not much, okay? So those are the most important elements of a goal, okay? And we can break that down into a couple of other things. I'm not going to go into a lot of depth in this because I just don't have the time to do it. But when we start talking about goals, we talk about different kinds of goals, like an avoidance goal versus an achievement goal. For Dorothy, when she says, I want to go home, that's an avoidance goal because her desire to go home is motivated by her fear of the Wicked Witch of the East, right? She's trying to avoid this threat, this harm. In my world, I use drug court as an example because a lot of people end up going into drug court not because they necessarily want to get into recovery right away. It's because they don't want to go to jail or prison, right? An avoidance goal. But at some point, that needs to switch to an achievement goal. An achievement goal is something where you actually gain something positive, right? You achieve something positive. Here's the thing to remember. Avoidance goals, highly motivating for a short period of time. Because eventually that fear subsides and the motivation towards the goal drops. Achievement goal, a little less motivating, but much longer term, right? The drug court data actually suggests that there is a point at which somebody, to be successful in drug court, they need to change that avoidance goal to an achievement goal. So at some point in that recovery process, their recovery becomes the goal. It's no longer about avoiding jail or prison. And those people tend to be more successful, okay? Proximate versus distal goals. This is long-term, short-term. That's basically a little different way of saying long-term, short-term. The benefit of short-term goals is that when you achieve them, you get this little hit of dopamine and it keeps you going to get the next goal, right? And so when you get distal goals, the important thing to remember is break that down, right? You want to get home, so now you got to find the wizard, right? And you got to follow the yellow brick road. So you start breaking the goals down into proximate goals. And then infinite goals is something I came up with based on some of the work of Simon Sinek around his new book, The Infinite Game. And I look at infinite goals as the visionary goals, right? Those are sometimes the goals that we desire, but achieving it isn't necessarily why we're chasing the goal, right? These are these big visionary goals that we will expend energy to chase, but achieving it is not really the ultimate point of it, right? These are like cause-driven goals, okay? All right. But it's not enough to have the goal. We got to have a pathway, and we call this pathway thinking. Now, this is actually pretty intuitive. We do this in our everyday lives all the time. We've got this goal, and we start thinking about how do we get there? What are the different things we could do to get there, right? And you create these different pathways or plans. If you hear somebody say, well, we've got plan A, and if something happens, we'll go to plan B, that's a marker of hopeful thinking because they're already thinking about multiple pathways to achieve their goal, okay? So maybe you've got 2 or 3 different pathways, but in pathway thinking, what we find is the higher level pathway thinking not only creates the pathway, but also starts to anticipate the barriers that might come up, okay? The things that might get in the way. And actually thinking about the things that we might do, the solutions, if those happen. And it might actually change the pathway that we choose in that analysis. So you can't just stop with the pathway. You got to think about what's going to come up that could get in our way, and how do we overcome that. And as we do that, as we get that process in place, we've got the goal, we've got the plan, right? We got the pathways, the strategies, whatever word you want to use. What that starts to do is increase our sense of agency because we become more and more convinced that we can get there and invested in getting there, willing to expend that energy. But agency, I think, is a combination of a couple of other things. And this is what I've come up with. This is kind of my own personal way of describing agency, because it took me a while to kind of get my head around this thing that we call agency. And I think it's actually a mixture of different stuff. One is efficacy, our belief in ourselves that we can effectively deal with the things that come at us, right? The second is courage, because whenever you deal with the future, you deal with risk. And when you deal with risk, you got to have some courage, right? Kennedy wrote a book where he basically opined that courage was actually one of the most important attributes for leadership. Now, he wrote that book long before hope theory was developed. Personally, I like to believe that today he would change that and say, oh, I think hope is, right? Because courage is embedded in that. It's part of agency. The third one is zest. That's the energy, right? The willing to roll up the sleeves and go. Zest, energy. And the fourth is grit. Angela Duckworth recently wrote a book called Grit. She's a researcher, psychologist, and best-selling book. And she defines grit this way. So this definition tells you why I think this belongs in hope. Passion and perseverance towards long-term goal achievement. Passion and perseverance towards long-term goal achievement. That's grit, okay? I have a deputy prosecutor in my office that graduated from West Point. And Duckworth's study was at West Point. She found that grit was highly predictive of success in graduation from West Point. They didn't do a hope study, but anyway, we like to banter about hope and grit, right? But there's 2 studies out there where hope and grit have been looked at together, and hope outperformed grit in both of them, so I like to. But it's because grit is a part of hope. That's how I see it, right? It's a part of there. And so ultimately we get to this place of hope, right? And the interesting thing is we experience our highest sense of hope when we achieve a goal. So think about, a time in your life when you've achieved a major goal. That felt good, right? Because again, what's happened is your brain just gave you a nice little dump of dopamine. We love dopamine, right? We love it. And what that dopamine is the human reward for goal achievement, okay? And from that feels empowering. And so what do we want to do? Start over again, create another goal, keep moving forward. I call this the hope cycle. The hope cycle, right? High hope thinkers, high hope people, turns out, will actually be working this hope cycle in multiple areas of their lives. They'll have, career goals, personal goals, hobby goals, education goals, you name it, throughout different areas of their life. And the reason for that is we don't want to put all of our hope eggs in one basket, if you will. Right? Because if we put them all in one basket and then we hit a barrier, that can have a much bigger dramatic impact on our hope than if we've got, even if we hit a barrier here, but we're achieving goals in other areas of our life, it can help keep our hope going so that we can deal with this one, okay? Now, if we looked at this on an organizational level, collective hope, it's exactly the same way, except now, when we're talking about organizations, that optimism is more about mission. Why do we exist? Why are we here? What is it that we're trying to achieve, right? What is our mission? And then when we talk about creating that future memory, that's our vision, the infinite goals, if you will. That's our vision, okay? And we build the common goals, the common pathways. And from that process, we build collective hope. What does that look like? What does that look like? That's a strategic plan, right? Mission, vision, goals, pathways, strategies. That's why we do strategic planning in a group, right? Strategic planning is a way of building collective hope. It is a tool to build collective hope. And so I'm a big advocate of strategic planning, and I don't have any one way of doing it. I've walked out of strategic planning processes where I felt confused and uninspired because they lost their way. We got into something else that wasn't about these core things, right? So the only thing I advocate about strategic planning is that it needs to be focused on these core things, right? What is the mission? What is the vision? What are the common goals? What are the common strategies, pathways, right? And when we achieve a goal, we set a new one, and we keep the hope cycle going. All right. So let's talk about this thing that I call hope-inspired leadership. We know what individual hope, we know collective hope. We've started to talk about now how that might impact a team or an organization. And so what does that mean for leadership? Gallup did a poll a few years ago, worldwide poll, where they asked the question of people, what do you most want from your leaders? What do you most want from your leaders? And they were very specific not to define leader, because they wanted that to be defined by the person answering the question. And here's the 4 things that came out as the predominant themes. Compassion, trust, there's that word, trust, stability, which I also interpret as things like safety, predictability, those kinds of things, right, are kind of included in that. And then finally, hope. Now, this was a Gallup poll. Shane Lopez, part of that poll, he's a hope theorist. So when we talk about hope here, hope means hope, the way I'm talking about it, right? It means that belief that we can make the future better. Those are the 4 things that people most want from their leaders: compassion, trust, stability, and hope. The interesting thing about those things is nothing about that has to do with position, power, authority, anything like that, right? Those are all about relationship and that kind of social environment, a culture, if you will. We're going to talk about that, right? So as I started to look at all this research on hope and started to think about that poll and look at all of the other literature that's out there on leadership, I've developed this philosophy that I call hope-inspired leadership, premised on 3 fundamental ideas. 1, it's servant-based leadership, right? Servant-based leadership. 2, it's culture-focused. It's culture-focused. It's not enough to focus on the individuals in the team. You got to focus on the team itself and the culture of the team. And 3, that it's hope-centered, meaning that the principles of hope are in play in doing this. All right, I guess I got enough time. This is going to spin up in a second to a video. We're going to use a little different movie to talk about this. Hunger Games. People see the Hunger Games? A lot of head nodding. Okay, all right. First time I watched the Hunger Games is because my kids were all over this movie, and I thought, oh, it's a pretty good movie, but I didn't have my hope lens on. Next time I watched it, I had my hope lens on, and when I got to this scene, it completely changed my viewpoint of this entire series of movies, okay? So let's watch the scene.
She earned it.
She shot an arrow at your head.
Well, I don't know.
Where your head? Down. Because, why do you think we have a winner?
What do you mean?
I mean, why do we have a winner? I mean, if we just wanted to intimidate the districts, why not round up 24 of them at random and execute them all at once? A lot faster. Hope.
Hope.
Hope. It is the only thing stronger than fear. A little hope is effective. A lot of hope is dangerous. Spark is fine, as long as it's contained. So contain it.
So of course, what he's talking about is this struggle that's going on with Katniss Everdeen, right? Becomes the Mockingjay in this, the symbol of the revolution. Okay, and he's trying to talk about how to handle her because she's become a problem for him. And the interesting thing about this scene is that he has shown keen awareness of the tension that exists between hope and fear and how that influences leadership. The irony here is that he understands it, but yet he is a leader through fear. Contain it, he says. He's a dictator, right? He leads through fear, power, right? Katniss never really thinks about the whole idea of hope and fear, but she leads through hope, right? If you haven't seen the films, I'm not going to give it away. Okay? But you might be able to guess, just based on where I'm at, which one wins in the end. Okay? But this is what I mean by servant leadership. Katniss is a servant leader, right? She leads by influence, building relationships, right? Setting example, leading through example, all of those kinds of things, building trust, all of those things, okay? You could say the same thing about Dorothy in The Wizard of Oz, right? I think most people would say she's the leader of that little team that gets formed because she has that influence. But it's got nothing to do with position, power, or authority. It's about servant leadership, okay? And so now when we take servant leadership and we start talking about, well, how does that translate to the team? That's where we start to talk about culture focused. And this is my attempt to try to diagram and take this idea of fear and trust, or fear and hope, if you will, and that tension that exists between those, and to illustrate it. Now, this is a work in progress, okay? Literally, this is a napkin sketch from a conversation that Chan Hellman and I had over dinner one night. We started talking about collective hope, and we started talking about this idea of trust and fear and how those influence it. And so he pulled out a pen, and we put a napkin out, and we started, and here's the best, latest result of that. If we assume that all organization teams have a culture, right, that there is a culture among this, there's a collective relationship that exists in some form or another. The thing that starts to give us clues about whether that culture is hopeful or not is by listening for the markers. And the markers can often be found in how people talk about the future and how they talk about the past. Okay? There's positive ways to talk about the future. When we talk about optimism, are people optimistic, right? When they talk about the past, are they nostalgic, meaning what comes to mind is the good things that have happened in the past, right? The things that we've achieved together, the good results of our work, right? They're nostalgic, okay? On the other hand, people can talk about those things in a negative way. So when they talk about the future, they might talk about it pessimistically, or they might worry. Worry, the enemy of hope. Worry is the enemy of hope because worry is the fixation on what are the bad things that could happen. A little bit of worry actually turns out is okay because that's what we do when we start solving problems, right? We worry a little bit and we go into problem-solving mode. If it becomes obsessive, that's a problem. And actually from here, this word, we start to go into anxiety, depression, all of those kinds of things, okay? Or when they talk about the past, do they ruminate? And that's a word that's used in psychology that talks about this idea of focusing on the bad things that have happened in the past, right? We ruminate on the bad things. And so part of how you can figure out what is your organizational culture and how you shape it is how you talk about the future and how you talk about the past, right? Leadership means staying up here, right? And exerting your influence up here. And so when we do that, when we talk about culture, the things that we're trying to kind of bring into our culture to lift it up, to build this idea of culture of trust, collective hope, right? This is that fourth element. Kindness, empathy, safety, honesty, courage, compassion, forgiveness. All of these things that you'll find in the literature that's out there about team building, that's all here. And the reason I put it in there is because, thanks Siri, it's all about building trust. Because when we build a culture permeated with trust, we build hope. Individual hope, collective hope. We have a hopeful culture. The outcomes of that, engagement, well-being, satisfaction, resilience, performance, retention, all of those kinds of things, okay? On the other hand, you can have influences that pull the culture down, and they are driven by fear. This has happened to, I think, a lot of organizations during the pandemic, my own included. During the pandemic, there was this kind of unsettling fear about the future, right? What does it look like? And so it started to permeate. And so we start seeing these kinds of things pop out: frustration, dishonesty, distrust, instability, gossip, all of those things, the indicators of a dropping culture. What we end up there is with a culture that is hopeless. Research tells us that's when we start to see stress, conflict, burnout, disengagement, absenteeism, turnover, all of those kinds of things. I'm not so sure that isn't, in a very big picture, one of the things that has led us to the big resignation. I don't know. I mean, I think that's one of the reasons that I wanted to come here and talk to all of you about it, because this is something I think you might want to be thinking about. You know better how to apply this to your work than I do. I just want to give you the framework, okay? But as leaders, what I tell people, as leaders, our responsibility is to always push up. Always push up, right? I actually had this conversation with my deputy prosecutors as we were approaching the end of the year, kind of coming into a new term, right? New term for an elected official is kind of like New Year's, right? It's kind of a new beginning. And so I talked about all the deputy prosecutors, put this up there, and I said, look, we have got to push up. We've got to push up, right? We all have an undivided interest in our culture. It's like community property. Now, you're not lawyers, so maybe you don't know. The definition of community property is an undivided 1/2 interest, right? Meaning that you have it half an interest, but there's no line to draw. That's kind of the way it is with an organizational culture, right? We all have ownership of a piece of the culture. And so the idea of leadership is to get, not only we push up, but we get everybody to push up, right? And to build hope in that culture. And then the other piece that we need, I think, to be effective is what I call alignment. Now, this actually kind of comes from, what's his name? PacMtn, right? The guy who wrote Death by Meeting, The 5 Dysfunctions of a Team, that series of books. He wrote one called The Advantage, and he was postulating, you could have 2 different organizations basically doing the same thing, one very successfully, one not so successfully. What's the difference, right? What are they doing different? And his argument was that a lot of the difference is this, what he calls alignment, organizational health, alignment. Okay, I was reading that book and it's like, this has hope all over it. He just doesn't use the word, right? But look, so I took this idea of alignment and created it through a hope lens, and here's what I've come up with, right? We start with this vision. Our organization is pushing towards those infinite goals. And then we create our strategic goals, and then we create the pathways and the sub-goals to get there. All that is driven by our mission, our purpose, our values. We develop this common sense of agency. But the whole idea is everything points the same way, right? Everything is aligned. It's all about alignment. Remember that phrase, hope is not a strategy? Hope I've convinced you otherwise. Hope is a strategy. I'll leave you with this phrase, penned by Martin Luther in 1600, which I think is incredible, given that hope theory was created in 1991 or something like that, 1990. Everything done in the world is done by hope. Everything done in the world is done by hope, meaning that everything what we've achieved as a people, as a society, whatever, is done because individually or collectively we set a goal, we created a pathway to get there, we summoned up the willpower, the energy to chase it, and we achieved that goal. And then we did it again, and then we did it again. You can't wait until life isn't hard anymore before you decide to be happy, a marker of agency. That's the power of hope. If I can be of any help to your organization, if you think something that I have said today might be useful, give me a call, drop me an email. I have a mission now to spread hope as much as possible. I'd be happy to do it. And also here's some resources that if you're interested in digging into this more. Thank you for having me today. And I hope that you are hopeful, a little bit more hopeful.